Imagine being told you can't buy something. Now imagine that something is a Ferrari. And now imagine you're Henry Ford II. There are cars. And then there are legends. Most cars take you from point A to point B. But some cars, rare ones, wild ones, born in fury and built on spite, those cars change history. Those cars don't just win races. They break empires. They humiliate kings. They rewrite the story of what American engineering can do when it is angry enough, focused enough, and just plain mad enough to make the impossible happen. This is the story of the Ford GT40. And before we're done here today, you're going to understand why this machine, low, loud, brutal, and beautiful, is not just the greatest racing car America ever built. It is the greatest act of revenge in motorsport history. Let's go back. Way back. Back to 1963. Henry Ford II, grandson of the legendary Henry Ford, the man who put America on wheels, is sitting in a boardroom, and he's excited. He's got a deal cooking. A big one. He's about to buy Ferrari. Now think about that for a moment. Ferrari. The most prestigious name in all of motorsport. The prancing horse. The Italian royalty of the racing world. Enzo Ferrari has been dominating Le Mans, the greatest endurance race on the planet, for years running. 6 consecutive years, his red cars have crossed that finish line first. 6 years of Ferraris spraying champagne while the rest of the world watched. And Henry Ford II wants in.
He wants a piece of that glory.
He wants the Ferrari name under the Ford umbrella. So Ford sends a team over to Italy. Accountants, lawyers, negotiators. They spend weeks there. They audit the Ferrari factory. They crunch the numbers. They shake hands and smile across long Italian dining tables. They spend millions of dollars just in legal fees and due diligence. They are absolutely certain the deal is coming together. And then, Enzo Ferrari says no. Not just no. He walks away.
He pulls the plug.
He cuts off negotiations at the very last moment because buried deep in the contract language was a clause. A clause that said Ford would have final say over Ferrari's racing activities. And Enzo Ferrari, a man who lived and breathed motorsport, a man whose whole identity was racing, was not going to let any American corporation tell him how to race his cars. He shut it all down. He sent Ford home. But that wasn't even the worst part. Word got back to Henry Ford II that Enzo Ferrari had laughed about it, that he had mocked the Americans, that he had said essentially that Ford didn't know what it was doing. That Ford was a company that made trucks and family sedans, not race cars. That Ford had no business being at Le Mans. Henry Ford II was furious. Not just professionally frustrated, personally furious. The kind of fury that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. The kind of fury that becomes obsession. He gathered his team. He slammed his fist on the table. And he said words that have become legendary in American automotive history. He looked his engineers in the eye and he said, "We are going to go to Le Mans, and we are going to beat Ferrari. Whatever it takes. Whatever it costs. Build me a car that will destroy him." And with those words, the Ford GT40 was born. Now here's where things get interesting, because Ford didn't exactly have a race car sitting in the garage ready to go. Ford was incredible at building cars Americans loved. The Mustang, the Galaxy, the Thunderbird. Mass production, American muscle, chrome and steel and power for the open highway. But a purpose-built endurance racing prototype? Something that could run flat out for 24 straight hours against the finest European machines? That was a different animal entirely. So Henry Ford II did what any smart man does when he needs expertise fast.
He went shopping.
Ford reached out to several European racing firms, Lotus, Cooper, Lola. And it was Lola that caught their attention. Because Lola had already built something remarkable, the Lola Mk6, a mid-engine GT car that had actually shown up at Le Mans in 1963 and turned heads, even though it didn't finish the race. The Lola had the bones Ford needed. It had the DNA of a potential world beater. Eric Broadley, Lola's founder and chief designer, agreed to a 1-year collaboration. Ford bought 2 of his Lola Mk6 chassis. They brought in John Wyer, the legendary ex-Aston Martin team manager, a man who knew endurance racing like most men know their own backyard. And they sent Roy Lunn, one of their own engineers, a man who'd already designed a mid-engine concept car for Ford, to work alongside the British team. They set up shop in Slough, England, just outside of London, near Heathrow Airport. They called the new company Ford Advanced Vehicles. And they started building. The car they were creating had one iron rule baked into its very design. It had to be no taller than 40 inches at the top of the windscreen. That was the minimum height the FIA rules allowed. So the engineers designed right down to that limit. They made this car as flat and as low as physically possible so it would slice through the air like a blade. GT Grand Touring. 40 inches tall. The Ford GT40. The name itself tells you exactly what this machine is. The first chassis rolled out of the Abbey Panels factory in Coventry on March 16, 1964. The very first Ford GT, chassis number GT101, was unveiled in England on April 1, 1964. It was powered by the 289 cubic inch Ford the Fifth 8 engine, the same high-performance engine living in the Mustang, here massaged and tuned for racing. Purchase price for a competition-ready car? £5,200 British pounds. An absolute steal, as history would prove.
Ford had built something.
Now they had to prove it could win. The GT40 made its racing debut in May 1964 at the Nürburgring 1,000 kilometers in Germany. The car held second place early on, showing real promise, real speed. And then the suspension failed. Race over. 3 weeks later came the real test. The 24 Hours of Le Mans. June 1964. The sacred cathedral of endurance racing. The track where Ferrari had been king for 6 straight years. Ford showed up with 3 GT40s, chest puffed out, ready to plant the American flag on European soil. All 3 cars retired. Not one finished. The mechanics went home. The engineers went back to the drawing board. Henry Ford II fumed. But here's what you have to understand about building greatness. Failure is part of the blueprint. Every legendary car, every legendary team, every legendary driver has a story of failure that preceded glory. The question is never whether you get knocked down. The question is whether you get back up and learn something. Ford learned.
Quickly.
After a difficult 1964 season under John Wyre's management, the program was handed over to Carroll Shelby. Now, if you know anything about American automotive history, you know that name. Carroll Shelby, the Texas chicken farmer turned racing driver turned automotive genius, the man behind the Shelby Cobra, the man who had already beaten Ferrari once with the Cobra in GT racing. If anyone could shake the GT40 program out of its slump, it was Shelby. The cars arrived at Shelby's shop still covered in the dirt and damage from their last race. Shelby complained they were poorly maintained, though in fairness, Ford's crew had simply packed up and shipped them immediately with no time to clean or repair. But Shelby's team went to work. And in February 1965, at Daytona, the Daytona 2,000 kilometers, Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby drove a Shelby-entered GT40 to victory. First win. Finally. The car worked. The car could win. A month later at Sebring, Ken Miles and Bruce McLaren finished second overall and first in the prototype class.
Progress.
Real progress. But Le Mans, that sacred, impossible, infuriating race, Le Mans still refused to yield. The 1965 GT40S again failed to finish at Le Mans. Ferrari was still laughing. 1966 was not a normal year for Ford. It was a year of total war. The engineers had spent months developing something new, a bigger, angrier version of the GT40. They took that already ferocious chassis, and they dropped in the 427 cubic inch Ford the Fifth 8. 7 liters of American muscle. The kind of engine that didn't ask permission and didn't apologize. The same basic engine that was winning NASCAR races. Modified for road course endurance racing, it produced power that the Europeans simply didn't have an answer for. This became the GT40 Mk2. And from the moment it appeared on track, it was obvious that something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a car trying to compete with the Europeans on their terms. This was America showing up and rewriting the terms entirely. February 1966. Daytona, now run in the 24-hour format for the first time ever. Ford's Mk2 machines finished first, second, and third. 1, 2, 3. A complete and utter domination. March 1966. Sebring 12 hours. GT40S again swept the top 3 positions. Ford was on a roll. The European press was starting to take notice. Ferrari was starting to get nervous. And then came June. The 24 Hours of Le Mans, 1966. This was the moment Henry Ford II had been building toward since the day Enzo Ferrari made him feel foolish. This was the race. This was the reckoning. Ford showed up with an armada. Multiple Mk2 cars. Carroll Shelby's team. The best drivers in the world. Ken Miles, brilliant, combative, utterly committed. Denny Hume. Bruce McLaren.
Chris Amon.
Dick Hutcherson. Ronnie Bucknam. Ferrari showed up with its magnificent 330 P3 prototypes. Beautiful machines. Fast machines. Machines that had every right to feel confident on a track they'd owned for 6 consecutive years. The race started. The GT40S ran like machines possessed. As the hours ticked by, the story became clear. The Fords were not just competitive, they were dominant. The 7-liter engines ate up the miles at a pace Ferrari simply could not match. One by one, the red Italian machines fell away. Mechanical failures. Retirement after retirement. And as Sunday morning broke and the finish approached, 3 Ford GT40 Mk2s were running at the front of the field. 3 American machines, 1, 2, 3. The result was so decisive, so complete, that Ford decided to orchestrate a photo finish. They wanted all 3 cars to cross the line together, a perfect visual statement of American supremacy. Now here's where it gets complicated. And a little heartbreaking. Ken Miles, the man who had perhaps done more than anyone to develop and push the GT40 to its potential, was in the lead. He and his co-driver Denny Hume had a 4-lap advantage at one point. He deserved that win. He'd earned it. But Ford's team management made a decision that still stirs debate 60 years later. They arranged for the 3 cars to cross the line in a photo finish together. And then the officials announced that due to the different starting positions of the cars, McLaren and Amon had started about 60 feet behind Miles. McLaren's car had technically covered more distance over the 24 hours and would be declared the winner. Ken Miles, having been asked to cooperate with the finish arrangement, having given everything to Ford's program, having driven brilliantly for 24 straight hours, lost. Either he slowed on the final lap in protest, or McLaren accelerated at the last moment. The accounts differ. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon were the official winners of the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. Ferrari's streak was broken. The American car had won. But Ken Miles never got his moment in the sun. Just 2 months later, in August of 1966, Ken Miles was killed testing the experimental J-car prototype at Riverside Raceway. The car's radical flat-topped bodywork created unexpected lift at high speed. The car went out of control. One of the greatest racing drivers of his generation, one of the truest believers in the GT40 program, was gone. Racing is glory. And sometimes, racing is heartbreak. Both things can be true. After the loss of Ken Miles and the lessons learned from the dangerous J-car, Ford's engineers went back to work. They took the revolutionary honeycomb aluminum chassis concept of the J-car and they completely rebuilt it into something safer, more aerodynamic, more refined. The result was the Ford GT40 Mk4. This was the most radical American racing machine ever built at that point in history. The chassis constructed entirely in the United States by Ford's performance division Carcraft. The body designed in Ford Studios, refined through weeks of simulated Le Mans laps on a test rig, an extraordinarily early use of computer-aided performance simulation that was decades ahead of its time. The aerodynamics were long and swooping, giving the car incredible top speed on Le Mans' legendary Mulsanne Straight, a 3.5-mile ribbon of asphalt where the fastest cars in the world hit their absolute limits. And limits were tested. The Mk4 proved to be the fastest thing at Le Mans in 1967, hitting 213 miles per hour on the Mulsanne. 213 miles per hour. In 1967, the driver lineup for the Mk4 included Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt. Gurney the smooth, precise, fearlessly fast American who'd already won Formula One races in Europe and who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and had to request a special bubble-shaped bodywork extension just to fit in the cockpit. Foyt, the four-time Indianapolis 500 champion, tough as Texas hardpan, who had just won the Indy 500 literally days before arriving at Le Mans. During practice, Gurney developed a strategy of backing completely off the throttle hundreds of yards before the Mulsanne hairpin and coasting into the braking zone, a way to nurse the brakes through the race. The lap times this produced confused and even alarmed the Ford team during practice, who worried Gurney had dialed out the car's setup trying to compromise for both drivers. They were wrong to worry. When the 1967 24 Hours of Le Mans began, for Mark IVs, 3 Mark IIs, and 3 Mark Is took the start. A full American invasion. Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt's Mk4, the car many considered least likely to win, despite Gurney's brilliance, ran perfectly. When the checkered flag fell on June 11, 1967, Gurney and Foyt crossed the line first. And in that moment, Dan Gurney did something that has since become one of the most iconic spontaneous celebrations in motorsport history. Standing on the podium, overcome with emotion, he shook the magnum of champagne and sprayed it over the crowd. Spontaneous, joyful, unrehearsed. And, according to motorsport historians, that was quite possibly the first time a driver ever sprayed champagne on a Le Mans podium, starting a tradition that has lived in motorsport ever since. The 1967 Sierra Leonean Leon's Mans victory was, and remains, the only truly all-American victory in Le Mans history. American drivers, American team, American chassis constructor, American engine manufacturer, American tires, Goodyear. Everything, 100% American. It has never been repeated. And it remains the only time a car designed and built entirely in the United States, both chassis and engine made on American soil, has won Le Mans outright. The Europeans had had enough. The speeds the big Ford the 58S were producing at Le Mans were becoming genuinely dangerous. 200 miles per hour on public roads, because the Mulsanne Strait was literally a public road closed for the race. Something had to give. The FIA, the governing body of international motorsport, stepped in. From 1968 onward, prototype racing cars would be limited to 3.0 liters of engine displacement, the same capacity limit as Formula One. That rule killed the 7-liter Mk2s and Mk IVs. It also killed Ferrari's V12 330p4 and several other cars that had been the giants of endurance racing. Ford's big guns were silenced. The party appeared to be over. Except, buried in the regulations was a loophole. A small door left open. Homologated GT-class sports cars, production cars built in sufficient numbers and approved for racing, could still compete with engines up to 5.0 liters, as long as at least 50 examples had been built. The GT40 Mk.I qualified. More than 50 had been built in 1965 alone. It was officially homologated. And with some permitted modifications, enlarged engine to 4.9 liters, improved cylinder heads, a new limited slip differential, better gearbox, the old Mk.I could still race. John Wyer. The same John Wyer who had managed the original GT40 program back in the early days before Carroll Shelby took over, now had his own team. The JW Automotive Engineering Team, sponsored by Gulf Oil. You know the livery. If you've ever seen a racing car in that gorgeous pale blue and vivid orange Gulf Oil color scheme, you know exactly what those colors mean. They mean class. They mean speed. They mean a very particular kind of cool that no other racing team in history has ever matched. Wyer's Gulf-sponsored GT40 Mk.Is were prepared meticulously. And they went racing. In 1968, with the new 3-liter prototype rules leaving the field thin and unreliable, Ferrari boycotted the whole season in protest. Wyer's GT40 Mk.I showed up at Le Mans and won. Pedro Rodriguez and Lucien Bianchi drove that beautiful Gulf-liveried car through 24 hours and crossed the line victorious, beating the best of what the underpowered 3-liter Porsches and Alfas could offer. The old car had done it again. And then, impossibly, thrillingly, almost unbelievably, it happened again in 1969. The 1969 24 Hours of Le Mans is one of the most dramatic races in the history of motorsport, and the GT40 is right at the center of it. Porsche had built something new and frightening, the 917, a flat, 12-powered monster that Porsche had built 25 of, just enough to get homologated, in a bold and expensive gamble. The 917 was raw and difficult to drive in 1969, not yet fully developed, but it had pure straight-line speed that was terrifying. The race began with the traditional Le Mans start. Drivers would stand across the track from their cars, sprint to them at the signal, jump in, start up, and go. No seatbelts were required by the rules. It was dramatic. It was theatrical. It was also, by 1969, widely recognized as genuinely dangerous. Belgian driver Jackie X, partnered in the GT40 MKI with British driver Jackie Oliver, made a statement before the race even started. In a deliberate, public protest against the unsafe tradition of the standing start, X walked to his car. Not ran.
Walked.
Slowly, calmly, deliberately. He strapped his seatbelts properly before starting. He was already well behind the rest of the field when his engine fired. For much of the race, the lead changed back and forth between the GT40 and the Porsche 908 of Hans Hermann. It was a battle between two fundamentally different philosophies, the old veteran American car with its big V8 doing what it knew how to do, and the nimble, lightweight European prototype. As the final laps approached, the Porsche's brakes began to wear. The Porsche team faced a decision: stop and change the brake pads in the final minutes, possibly losing the lead and maybe the race, or push through to the finish on deteriorating brakes and hope they held. They chose to push through. And Jackie X, the young Belgian rookie at Le Mans, a man who would go on to win that race 6 times in his career, primarily with Porsche in later years, drove the wheels off that old Gulf GT40 MKI, relaxed, measured, heroic at exactly the right moments. He extracted every last tenth of a second from a car that was, let's be honest, already a dinosaur by 1969 standards. The finish was by a matter of a few seconds. Just seconds after 24 hours of racing. The GT40 MKI, chassis number GT40P/1075, the same exact chassis that had won Le Mans in 1968, crossed the line first. The same car. 2 consecutive Le Mans victories. The greatest old warrior in the history of endurance racing. Jackie X had walked to his car before the start, and he walked into history at the finish. So let's step back. Let's take a breath. And let's talk about what all of this actually means, not just as history, but as a story about America. The Ford GT40 was born from anger. From wounded pride. From a billionaire's fury at being laughed at by an Italian who thought Americans couldn't build real race cars. But anger alone doesn't win races. Anger just gets you to the starting line. What wins races is the thing that anger was converted into: obsession, discipline, innovation, and the willingness to fail and get back up and try again and again until you get it right. Ford failed in 1964. They failed again in 1965. And they could have walked away. The program was expensive. The results were embarrassing. The European press wasn't exactly being kind to the American intruders. But they didn't walk away. They learned. They adapted. They hired the right people, gave them the right resources, and let them do what brilliant engineers and drivers do when they're given what they need. And then they didn't just win. They annihilated. 4 consecutive Le Mans victories, 1966, 1967, 1968, 1969. 4 different versions of the same car concept, each one a chapter in the story. The dominant Mk2 showing brute American force could beat European elegance. The revolutionary Mk4 demonstrating that American engineering could be sophisticated as well as powerful. And then the humble, beautiful, Gulf-liveried Mki, already old, already supposedly outclassed, outlasting everything the Europeans threw at it through clever preparation, brilliant driving, and sheer bloody-minded reliability. In 1966, when the GT40 broke Ferrari's winning streak, it was the first time an American manufacturer had won a major European race since Jimmy Murphy drove a Duesenberg to victory at the 1921 French Grand Prix. 45 years between American victories in Europe. And Ford ended that drought in the most emphatic, dramatic fashion imaginable. The Ford GT40 didn't just beat Ferrari. It taught Ferrari a lesson that resulted in the Italians changing how they approached endurance racing for the next decade. It forced the FIA to change the rules because the car was too fast, too dominant. It pushed the entire sport forward. Today, original GT40s are among the most valuable and revered race cars in existence. In 2018, a Mk2 that finished third overall at the 1966 Sierra Leone's man sold at auction for $9,795,000. Nearly $10 million for a racing car. And honestly, worth every penny. The car's influence extends into the present day. The modern Ford GT, introduced in the early 2000s and then revived again in 2016, is a direct spiritual descendant, built in tribute to the original. Ford even took the modern GT back to Le Mans in 2016 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the original victory. And they won their class. Some stories don't just end. They keep going. Before we close this chapter, we owe something to the people who made this story possible. Because cars don't race themselves. Machines don't feel fury. Men and women do. Henry Ford II, the man whose wounded pride sparked everything. He could have simply moved on after Ferrari embarrassed him. Instead, he made one of the great decisions in automotive history. He said, "Build me something that wins." And he meant it, and he backed it with money and commitment when the early results could easily have justified giving up. Carroll Shelby, the larger-than-life Texan who took a troubled program and turned it into a winning one. Shelby understood drivers. He understood what it took to win, not just to be fast. His fingerprints are all over the GT40's greatest victories. Ken Miles, perhaps the most tragic figure in this story. Brilliant, difficult, committed, honest to a fault. He gave everything to the GT40 program and deserved the 1966 Sierra Leone's man's victory more than almost anyone. He never got it. And 2 months later, he was gone. His legacy lives in every GT40 that ever turned a lap at speed. Dan Gurney and A.J. Foyt, the two Americans who drove to that 1967 Sierra Leone's man's victory, the all-American triumph that has never been repeated. Two giants of American racing on the same day at the most prestigious race in the world. Jackie Ickx and Jackie Oliver, the men who drove chassis GT40P/1075 to back-to-back victories in 1968 and 1969. Ickx especially, who walked to his car when everyone else ran, who drove with such intelligence and control that the old MK-I could still beat the best the new generation could offer. John Wyer, the quiet, precise Englishman who was there at the very beginning and there at the very end, who managed the Ford Advanced Vehicles program in its infancy and who then ran the Gulf-liveried MK-Is to their 1968 and 1969 victories. The steady hand throughout the entire GT40 era. These are the people who built the legend. The car was the weapon. They were the soldiers. The Ford GT40 is 40 inches tall, lower than most dining room tables. Low enough that you have to fold yourself almost in half just to get inside. The cockpit is tight, hot, overwhelming with noise and vibration and mechanical fury. And yet, in that brutal little space, some of the greatest moments in American motorsport history were born. In that cockpit, drivers found glory and heartbreak and speed and sometimes death. In that cockpit, America answered the Europeans with an eloquence that no speech could ever match. Henry Ford II wanted Ferrari beaten. The GT40 beat Ferrari. And then it beat everyone else too. And then it beat the rules that were written specifically to stop it. And then it beat time itself, winning races years after it should have been obsolete. The Ford GT40 is proof that when America decides to do something, when real resources meet real talent and real commitment, there is nothing in this world that cannot be beaten. Ferrari laughed in 1963. Nobody was laughing in 1966. Nobody was laughing in 1967. Nobody was laughing in 1968. And in 1969, when that old Gulf Blue warrior crossed the Le Mans finish line by just a handful of seconds, after 24 hours of racing at the limit of everything, there was only one sound. the roar of a 4.9-liter Ford the Fifth Fate, and the roar of history being made. Thanks for riding with us today. If you love American automotive history, classic cars, and the stories of the machines and the people who made them legendary, hit that subscribe button because we've got more stories like this coming. Drop a comment below. What GT40 moment is your favorite? The 1966 finish? Gurney's champagne spray in 67? Ix walking to his car in 69? Let us know. And we'll see you in the next one.